Namaskar. Welcome to one more episode of What Does This Data Say? Here in Telangana, KCR and KTR have been in the news for several reasons. Last week, KTR or KT Ramarao, who is the IT and Municipal Administration Minister of the state, made a shocking statement in the Legislative Assembly. Here KTR is referring to the local military authorities in Hyderabad and Secunderabad cantonment areas. He says that without any reason the authorities keep troubling the civil population here, and further goes on to say that if they don't understand, we will have to take some strict measures like cutting off the water or the water supply to the army areas. Now, why did he have to use such harsh words? And since we are talking of Secunderabad cantonment area, I'll first quickly go through the structure of a cantonment board so that you can understand the implications. Now, the primary functions of a cantonment board are very similar to a municipal corporation. Now, the structure of a cantonment board is that it is headed by a president who is the station commander of the area. That's a ex officio position. The president then nominates 3 more army officers as board members. Now, there is a CEO of the board who is appointed by the government, and he is the officer from the Defense Estate Services cadre. The CEO here reports to the president, and so much so that his annual confidential report is written by the station commander. Then there are other ex officio members like the district magistrate, the health officer, and the executive engineer. Now, from the side of the public, there are elected members. Depending on the size of the cantonment, these numbers vary. Like here in Secunderabad, we have 8 members representing each ward. Among them is there is an elected vice president, but however the vice president's power are far less than that of a president or a chief executive. Now, as you see, the entire structure is totally army oriented. In fact, the president has overriding powers. In case of a dispute, the matter is then referred to the sub-area commander of that region. Like here, it will go to the Andhra and Telangana sub-area commander. Now, this structure was probably okay when the area was predominantly army oriented, or a lot of army people were staying here. Over the years, the civilian population has outgrown the army. In fact, the cantonments today are surrounded by civilian areas. Now, in this structure, things don't work primarily because the army officers who are heading, firstly, they are not trained, they cannot run a municipal corporation, they are not capable to run it, and they are not inclined to run it. They are posted for 1 year, 2 year or 3 year term and then go away. So they hardly have any knowledge of the local issues, they don't know the local language, and they sit to administer the functions of a municipal corporation, and that really doesn't work on the ground. Now, obviously, KTR's statement did not go down well with the opposition people, which is the BJP. Now, BJP, without understanding any of these issues, the minister here, G. Kishan Reddy, comes out with a usual statement like anything you say against Modi, you say against BJP, you say against anyone in BJP, you become a anti-national. And he puts all sorts of comments which are totally meaningless and have nothing to do with the problem. They only try to start fishing in the troubled waters. Now, in today's episode, I am going to introduce you to Pankaj Sethi. Pankaj not only is my friend and colleague, he now runs a very successful electronic design and manufacturing unit in Hyderabad. Now, he has been doing lot of research on this topic for the past several years and has a very strong grip on this situation. And he has been writing in the local press. In fact, last week, the news items were also carried in the national news. So it's over to Pankaj. This episode may be a little longer than usual, but I can assure you it is really worth it if you see it till the end. So we have Pankaj Sethi with us today. So thank you, Pankaj, for joining us. Pankaj has been working on this for a very long time. I know for the last 6-7 years, he has been digging out all the data. So we'll hear from him today that what is the problem Secunderabad cantonment residents are facing. So Pankaj, please go ahead.
And thank you for having me on the show. I'll briefly explain the issues as I see them. And what I'm going to say is basically divided into two parts. The first part is to do with the road closure in Secunderabad cantonment. When it happened, what are its effects? What happened legally related to that? And then how did the citizens react? And then ultimately, what is the present status? The second part is slightly different in the sense, but complementary to what I will be speaking in the first part. And this part is to do with the peculiar nature of Secunderabad cantonment when compared with other cantonments in the country. The problem started for citizens in Secunderabad in about 2014 or 2013, when the army authorities closed a number of roads in Secunderabad cantonment. Now, as you can see in the map of closed roads, Secunderabad cantonment in that map is the roughly the English letter J-shaped white area in the middle of the map. It starts from the north, goes down to the south, and then curves up again on the western side. Not all of this the area of this the total area of the cantonment is about 40 square kilometers. And the road closures do not affect the entire cantonment. So if you look at the map carefully, there is this dark green line running from top to bottom, that is north to south. Almost the entire height of the letter J. This is an arterial road in Secunderabad. It is called Rajiv Rahadari. It is also State Highway 1, which connects Secunderabad to Karimnagar, Siddipet, and Chandrapur in Maharashtra. Right. And as you can see, the red lines in the map indicate closed roads. The green lines indicate open roads. And most of these red lines, as you can see, are to the right of this thick gray line, which is Rajiv Rahadari or State Highway 1. Right meaning towards the east. Now, as you can see, although the north-south extent is almost 10 kilometers from a place called Hakimpet till Maredpalli, which is in the city, and Hakimpet is on the outskirts of the city. The east-west extent is not that much. The east-west extent is maybe a maximum of 2 kilometers. It narrows, it widens, but it's not more than about 2 kilometers at any place. Now, there's a whole area of Secunderabad which is to the east of these red lines. In other words, if you look at the entire city, this area is in the northeastern part of the city. And as you can see, the northeastern part of the city, anybody who stays in the northeastern part of the city necessarily has to use roads through the cantonment to access Rajiv Rahadari. And if you look at it, it comprises about 10% of the population of the city. Right. So that is the number of people who are affected by the road closure. This is because of the peculiar geography of the cantonment and the area in which the roads have been closed, the eastern part of the city. So these are very old roads, and suddenly they were closed in 2014. Now, let us move to the next step. So when these roads were closed, there was obviously a lot of angst. There was a lot of protest among the people. And ultimately, it led to some court cases also being filed in the then Andhra Pradesh High Court at Hyderabad. This was before the partition of the state into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So a bunch of petitions were filed, and the High Court, in its wisdom, combined all of them and heard them together. In its initial interim judgment, the High Court agreed with the petitioners, that is, with the citizens who were affected, and said that this road closure cannot be tolerated and the army must reopen all the roads. The army appealed against the interim judgment. They went to the division bench, including the then Chief Justice, who then remanded it back to the single judge who was hearing the case. And at this stage, army produced a sealed cover. Now, what is in the sealed cover, nobody knows, because the petitioners' lawyers were not shown the contents of the sealed cover. The judge listened to the army and he said, I've seen the sealed cover. There is a security threat. The army is allowed to close the roads. Now, so this is in a nutshell what happened in the court cases. In 2014, they were decided. Because after the court cases were decided in army's favor, army actually went ahead and started closing more roads. So that is when people started waking up. So there's a lot of protest. And at that time, Mr. Manoj Parrikar was the defense minister, and some of the local politicians represented to him. And he got orders issued. The High Court judgment was in September 2014, and in January 2015, he got orders issued from the Ministry of Defense to reopen the roads. Now, the roads were not reopened. And if we see, one of the reasons seems to be that the wording of the letter left certain loopholes, which the army exploited. So they said all these roads are roads within their unit lines. And the orders issued at the time of Mr. Parrikar said that, the reopening orders would apply to roads outside the unit lines. So this is the plea that the army took. And whenever somebody questioned them, they said, we have a security threat. They said, these are what they call A1 roads. And these are our roads. Public have no right of way on them. So this is when, the affected people wanted to find, and they were not getting a hearing. They wanted to find a solution to their woes. And some of them started, researching the matter in more detail. And in fact, I was also, because I stay in an area and I was also affected by the road closure. I also started doing a bit of research, and what we found is the High Court had been given wrong information, on the basis of which it probably reached an erroneous judgment. None of us are lawyers, including myself, but being affected people, we tried to read the applicable act, which is the Cantonments Act, and the rules framed under the Cantonments Act, which are the Cantonment Land Administration rules. I mean, it was a simple thing. What is this so-called A1 road? Is it really something which, they have the right to close unilaterally? So two things we found. One, in the law, there is a provision to close roads. There is something called the Section 258 of the Cantonments Act. It allows closure of what the Act calls streets. The word road is not used. The word street is used. And the street is defined in the Act as any road or path or passage or bridge, etc., over which public have right of way. That is the definition of a street. So if a street has to be closed, the competent authority to close the street is the Cantonment Board, and not the local military authority, which had actually been closing these roads. So the next step was to see whether these roads which had been closed are streets as per the definition of the Act, which means whether the public have right of way on that or not. So when we examined this particular aspect, we found that the rules which are framed under the Act, the Cantonment Land Administration Rules of 1937, have a clear-cut provision, have a clear-cut definition of what are A1 roads. So there were two things that were done. One, the Defence Estates Office was requested via an RTI application to furnish an extract of the General Land Register as the record pertains to the roads. And what we found is that the CLAR, the Cantonment Land Administration Rules, clearly specify the method in which the roads have to be recorded. First thing it says is that each road over which public have right of way has to give in a separate survey number, separate from the plots of land around it. However, if a bunch of such roads are maintained by the same agency, in this case, the Military Engineering Service or MES, then the same number, they can all be clubbed under the same survey number. So when we've got the GLR extract, we found that this bunch of roads which had been closed had been given, in their GLR The survey number assigned was 778. And this is different from the survey numbers assigned to the plots of land around, along or by the sides of these roads. So it seems to be public roads. The other thing that the Cantonment Land Administration rules say is that a road is to be classified as A1 only if public have right of way on it, which can be seen again in the extract which is there on the screen right now. That if a road is classified, so the corollary is that if a road is classified as A1 in the General Land Register, then that means there is an admission that this is a public road. So when we got this information, the next step was to see then why the court wasn't given this information. And then when we looked into the affidavits filed by the CEO, the Cantonment Chief Executive Officer, the Defense Estates Officer, and so on, we found that they had made claims in their sworn affidavits that these are not public roads, that public do not have right of way over. Now, if the court is given that information, then I would say that it is to be expected that it would reach a conclusion that perhaps these are roads over which public do not have right of way. So anyway, this was the discovery made over a period of time, and the net result of all this was that by that time these road closures had become very serious, and many more roads were being closed left and right, or they would close them. They would close them in the nights. They would close them without announcing. On 15th August or 26th January and so on. So essentially all this information was collated and a representation made to the then Defense Minister, Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman. Now she seems to have ordered an investigation. She also called a meeting of the MPs and the vice presidents of all the cantonment boards of all 62 cantonments in the country. Probably had the matter examined and found that there was some strength in what was being represented. And on 20th of May 2018, the ministry announced through a press note that they are ordering the reopening of all roads which have been closed without following the due process. The due process is given in section 258 of the Act. That process involves that, if Army has a concern about security, they can approach the Cantonment Board. The Cantonment Board then publishes advertisements and generally publicizes the fact that they might be wanting to close a road permanently. Then they invite public objections. Public can object to it. Each objection has to be addressed. This decision has to be made in a full meeting of the Cantonment Board. And if the Cantonment Board then passes a resolution to close the road, then that has to be approved by the General Officer commanding, Southern Command in our case, in the case of Secunderabad. Meanwhile, a meeting of the Cantonment Board had taken place in which this matter was a very heated topic of discussion, and it was decided and it was resolved that a joint inspection will be carried out by the Army authorities, by the Cantonment Board CEO, by the MP of the area, and by the affected civilians to identify all the closed roads. This was at the end of May 2018 itself. So a lot of things happened in 2018, but this inspection has still not taken place. It is 2022 today.
So I hope you have now understood the issue of road closure in Secunderabad cantonment. Actually, the local military authority is exercising extra constitutional power. There seems to be a tussle between the Ministry of Defense and the Army here in Secunderabad. The ownership issue has also been settled. These roads belong to the public. They are maintained by the Cantonment Board using the Cantonment Board funds, which comes under the Ministry of Defense, and many of us who stay here are paying taxes to the Cantonment Board. We now come to the part 2 of this discussion, which very briefly we will talk about the history of Secunderabad and how these cantonments got to be formed and to whom does this land actually belong to.
One fact which distinguishes Secunderabad cantonment from the other 60 odd cantonments, Secunderabad and Aurangabad cantonments in India, from the other 60 cantonments, there are a total of 62, and Secunderabad is the second largest cantonment in the country after Delhi. One fact which distinguishes Secunderabad and Aurangabad is that these were not part of British India before independence. Secunderabad and Aurangabad were part of the Hyderabad state, which was ruled by the Nizam of Hyderabad. So it was a princely state, and in fact, it was the largest princely state in terms of population and the second largest in terms of size after Kashmir. Well, the British came here as a result of a treaty between them, between the East India Company and the then Nizam, the second Nizam of Hyderabad, at the end of the 18th century. And this treaty was basically a treaty in which basically was signed so that both parties could help each other against common enemies. At that time, they had common enemies like Tipu Sultan to start with, the Marathas after that. And both were fighting wars with Tipu also and with Marathas also. So anyway, that is part of history. The Nizam allied with the East India Company. Now, one aspect of this treaty was that both sides were to provide troops to the other in case required against common enemies. So the British fulfilled their part of the bargain by placing a body of troops inside the Hyderabad state. When they placed a body of troops inside Hyderabad, the important point is that they did not conquer Hyderabad. They were here as part of an arrangement between two sovereign powers, or between a sovereign power and a commercial company, because the East India Company still at that point of time was not sovereign Britain. It was still a commercial company, trading company. Now, obviously, if the troops had to be stationed here, about 8,000 troops were stationed here. British troops were stationed here. And if they had to be stationed, then they had to be given quarters, or place where they could set up camps. And the Nizam provided some space on the banks of the Hussain Sagar Lake in Hyderabad, right, on the northeastern banks, in the place which is today called Kawadiguda. And that is where the initial camps were set up. And another aspect of the treaty was that, the British insisted and the Nizam agreed that whatever goods and services would be required by the troops would be free of customs duties. Please don't charge customs duties, because at that time Hyderabad was an independent state. So, even if something came in from Bombay, customs duties were charged on it. So Nizam agreed to that. Now, this became, in a sense, the first sort of duty-free zone in the country. And that drew a whole bunch of traders from all parts of the country, from Gujarat, from Maharashtra, from UP, from Tamil Nadu. So there was a huge civilian influx to supply goods and services to the troops. So this encampment, which was initially a British troop encampment, drew a lot of civilians also, and soon grew into a sizable sort of settlement. And the British proposed to the third Nizam, because the second Nizam had passed away by then. In 1806, they proposed to the third Nizam, Secunderabad, that, we'll name this place after you. And he called it, okay, agreed. So that is how it came to be called Secunderabad. Now, as the British provided troops for the Nizam was also supposed to provide troops for the British as part of the treaty. So Nizam said, here is my troops, here are my troops. The British said, your troops are useless. Right. They have no training, low morale. So let us do one thing. We will set up troops, some more troops for you. At your cost, of course, because you're supposed to provide us troops. So they recruited some local troops, and at Nizam's cost, they set up another contingent. The first contingent, which was the first set of troops, 8,000 troops, were called the subsidiary troops, the subsidiary force, because the treaty was called the Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance. The second body of troops which was set up was called the Hyderabad contingent. This was supposed to be technically the Nizam's contribution to the British. But it was under the British because they set it up, saying that we will train them to our standards. And this bunch was provided quarters slightly north of Secunderabad, about 10 kilometers north of Secunderabad, in a place called Bolaram. So the Hyderabad contingent, which is what this body of troops was called, was stationed. So it was two separate cantonments of Bolaram and Secunderabad. Mm. And this business continued for almost a century. And these troops, by that time, by the end of the 19th century, the British had fought all their wars. They had defeated the Marathas, they had defeated the Sikhs. So everybody, whatever they had to conquer, they had conquered. And they basically were ruling about 60% of the country's area by then. The remaining 40% remained under the princely states, of which Hyderabad was one. Right. And at that point of time, it was decided to disband the Hyderabad contingent, merge both these units with the so-called Indian Army, and also combine the cantonments of Bolaram and Secunderabad into one entity, which was called the Secunderabad, the Greater Secunderabad area, or Secunderabad. And because Bolaram was 10 kilometers north of Secunderabad, there were several villages between them, and those were also merged with this entity. So this is the crux of the matter. When this merger took place, the Nizam issued a farman merging these two. And here is the proof that British did not own any land here. The farman clearly says, you can see it on the screen now. The farman clearly says that the ownership rights of the original owners will be protected.
Right.
Whether they are zamindars, I mean, the zamindars were actually not there, they were jagirdars, or Nizam himself, or private owners. Their rights are protected. Now, in the succeeding years, this question must have come up several times. The British themselves must have had doubts whether we own any piece of land, because by that time they were essentially ruling a lot of areas and they owned the land in a lot of other parts of the country. So in 1926, a sort of investigation was ordered, and the then British resident in Hyderabad, Sir William Barton, was asked to investigate and answer this question of whether the British own any land. And he came up with a very comprehensive report in 1926, which is today called the Barton Report. And it clearly says that they don't own a square inch of land in Secunderabad. So if this is the case, then our doubt as researchers, in investigating various things to do with road closure and all that, our doubt was, how did the central government come to own this land then, 1948? So, and whatever was owned by the British passed to the government of India after independence, sure. But here the land was not owned by the British. So how come it passed to the government of India? Because today the land record in the cantonment shows that the land public lands belong to government of India. So this sort of raised very intriguing questions. And we found that a complete land record had actually been made in 1933 under the British also. Now, what caused this land record to be made? In 1925, the British passed the first Cantonments Act. For the first time,
Right.
the rules and laws, etc., governing cantonments were codified, and the Cantonments Act of 1925 was passed. And under that, rules were framed. And what we found is that the rules which were framed from the rest of India did not apply to Hyderabad. A special set of rules were made for Hyderabad, which are called the Cantonment Land Administration Rules, brackets, Hyderabad and Aurangabad, 1930.
Right.
And in that it is clearly, private land is recognized, Nizam land is recognized, Jagirs are recognized. Now, under these land rules, the purpose of the land rules is what? Is to create a land record. So the first proper land record was created under these rules in 1933. And that land record is available in the Cantonment Board Defence Estates Office today also. When that was obtained through an RTI, the entire land record clearly admits the presence of Nizam's land, of all sorts of privately owned and Jagir owned and government owned and state owned land, but nothing to do with the British. So how did this 1933 General Land Register transform into the 1956 General Land Register, which is still effective today, which is still counted on as a statutory document today? How did Government of India come to acquire this land or come to own this land? So when we tried to answer these questions, in fact, this was posed in one of the court cases. And the counter affidavit from the other side, from the defense side, was that the Nizam surrendered. Nizam signed an instrument of surrender. The Nizam signed a instrument of accession, and so on. We said, show us. Where is that instrument? And in this search, and in fact, this is a pretty recent discovery, the National Archives have some documents to offer. And those documents show what really happened, because Hyderabad did not merge with India in 1947.
Right.
In fact, the Nizam held out. Nizam didn't want to merge with India. He said, I'll be independent, like Kashmir was asking to be independent. And there was a huge turmoil going on in the state of Hyderabad at that time, because there was a massive farmers' revolt also going on around that same time. The farmers were revolting because they were being oppressed by the aristocracy who owned the land. And the farmers' revolt had become communist dominated. So Finally, and then there was also the communal angle, because there were this group called Razakars who had gone around, started, atrocities against Hindus and so on. So finally, Sardar Patel in 1948 decided enough is enough, and India sent in its troops in September of 1948. And the Nizam forces, had to, they were not really well equipped and all that, but so they surrendered in 3 days. And Hyderabad became part of India. Now the files in the archives show what happened after. So this army came in under General J.N. Chaudhary, Jayantanath Chaudhary. He was appointed also after Hyderabad surrendered. He was appointed military governor of Hyderabad under the control of Sardar Patel, not directly, but through VP Menon. VP Menon was the advisor to the states ministry. See, remember, 1948 means the constitution wasn't done yet. Constitution was still being prepared. The Constituent Assembly was sitting. So the interim government was in charge. And in the interim government, Sardar Patel headed the Ministry of States, as it was called. It was not called the Home Ministry at that time. It was called the Ministry of States. And VP Menon was his advisor. And in fact, today he is referred to as the chief architect of the integration of princely states with India. That was the major exercises going on. Already they had managed to convince almost all the states except 3-4, that is Junagadh, Travancore, Kashmir and Hyderabad. Junagadh was settled, Travancore was settled, Kashmir settled itself in a way because, Pakistan sent in its forces and then a ceasefire came into. But Hyderabad was holding. And then now Hyderabad also had been, police action or whatever. It had become part of it. So now there was no popularly elected government here. The military governor was in charge. He was being advised by the Ministry of States.
Right.
The two biggest problems facing them was the state was penniless. Despite the Nizam being the richest man in the world, the state was penniless. Because the Nizam government in its last days had run the economy into the ground, literally. And secondly, there was this massive violent farmers' protest going on. They had farmers had already taken control of over 350 villages in the districts of Nalgonda and Warangal. And they had burnt Jagirdars' houses, and there was a lot of violence going on, and armed revolt it was. So this needed to be tackled. And what General Chaudhary advised the Ministry of States was that, we need to tackle the root cause. We can put in police, we can put in a lot of law and order measures, but we need to tackle the root cause of the revolt. And the root cause is the land ownership. The fact that the farmer doesn't own the land. And, in fact, when he ordered a sort of a report, and within 4 weeks, to their credit, in 4 weeks, a report was prepared giving the entire land holding pattern of the state of Hyderabad. Of the 210,000 square kilometers, 20,000 plus square kilometers was directly owned by the Nizam of Hyderabad. Another 60,000 was Jagirdars, Paigas, and what are called Rajas of these Samsthan areas. And all of these were basically feudatories of the Nizam, in the sense that they were allowed to collect revenue. But that land did not belong to those Jagirdars or Rajas. It also belonged to the Nizam. So Nizam, directly or indirectly, owned 80,000 square kilometers out of 210,000. Almost, a third of the land area, or more than a third of 40% of the land area. What General Chaudhary said, we must prevail upon the Nizam to hand over these lands. Hand over to whom? Hand over to the new nascent state of Hyderabad, so that land reforms can be carried out. And if necessary, let us compensate. And this is what is revealed by these files. And it is a very interesting thing, because, it's basically a record of meetings and letters from Chaudhary after every time he met Nizam, his reaction, all that is there in that. And finally, the Nizam agreed. Well, Nizam agreed. There was a deal between the government of India and the Nizam, and his privy purse, which was promised to him, was enhanced from 50 lakhs per annum to 1 crore per annum. As compensation for what is called Sarfe, for giving up this Sarfe Khas land. Sarfe Khas was the lands owned by him, by the Nizam. And he was also, it's beautiful. These are dedicated individuals working for integrating the state without causing more problems.
Right.
They convince him, we will not disclose any of this. The notification that will be issued will be under your farman. And in that farman, all it will say is that the Nizam has taken note of the situation prevailing and has decided to hand over his lands to Diwani. Diwani is state government. So that's how the land came to be actually transferred to the state government. And then the land reforms were carried out. In no time at all, the farmers' revolt was contained. So now what does it say? This land also included the cantonment land.
Yeah.
So this is a new thing, and this is what probably explains the CM statement and the minister's statement in the state assemblies recently. So this has added a slightly new dimension here, because once you say that it is the state which owns the public lands here and not the central government, then I don't know where it leads, because frankly, the justification for a cantonment goes away, because a cantonment, by definition, central government administered territory. And also the entire Cantonment Act, almost 400 sections of it are to do with basically how cantonment land is supposed to be managed. So this is the state of affairs right now. I hope I've been able to convey this.
Okay. Very interesting. And I think there's a long way to go now. It will be a long fight. If at all it starts, I don't know which way it will go. So thank you so much. Thank you very much for sparing your time.